You know, Morgan, you and I have talked about Iran a lot, in part because there's a sort of a budding revolution going on that I think is completely underreported in this country. But what do you make about the saber rattling that we've seen in the last 24 hours?
Well, good afternoon, Charles. Always good to see you, even from across the television. So to me, Charles, this looks like a coordinated effort amongst the administration's top officials, their messaging on Iran. I don't think that the president's tweet was sent by accident this morning. I don't think it was sent in vain. I think it was sent out because this administration has decided that Iran is incredibly vulnerable right now from an economic perspective, which you and I could go into, but also from a political perspective. We've seen over the past 18 months mass protests in Iran, and that frustrates the Iranian government and scares the Iranian government more than anything. You're seeing teachers and union workers protesting. Just the past few days, we actually saw members of the Iranian military protesting the army because of their unpaid, some of their unpaid wages, some of their unpaid pensions. So this is similar, I would think, to the early 2009 Green Revolution protests that we saw under President Obama. This is happening again, and I think that it's more worrisome to the Iranian regime this time because when they received billions of dollars of sanctions relief from the Obama administration, the Iranian people were told, we're going to bring Iran into the mainstream, this money is going to benefit all of us. That didn't happen, Charles. Instead, what happened was the Iranian regime lined their own pockets and they used it as a slush fund to fund the Iran Revolutionary Guard to foment terrorism and military action around the world. And so the Iranian people themselves are frustrated, and as they should be.
To your point, Mike Pompeo, in his speech on Sunday in California, which, you know, has 250,000 Iranian Americans, and obviously it's a great conduit to getting the word back to Iran, that Ayatollah Khomeini has an off-the-books hedge fund worth $95 billion, that the judiciary chief in Iran has a net worth of $300 million. I mean, these people, I mean, $95 billion? You know, people have to be up in arms about that.
They should be. I think that it was interesting to me that the administration went so public with that information. Again, I see this as an incredibly targeted campaign, a targeted effort by this administration to reach out to the Iranian people and say, yes, your worst fears about this regime are right. They are keeping this money, hoarding this money for themselves to be the #1 state sponsor of terror in the entire world. And these veterans from the Iranian military were protesting because they're not getting their pension paid. Meanwhile, there's a $95 billion slush fund that you just talked about. Yeah,
it's crazy. And of course, they were going to use the Voice of America to help get around the internet censorship there, a 24/7 Farsi language channel to go across television, radio, digital, and social media. So I think this is really some good stuff. I do want to move on, though, and ask you about critics, because they're now calling for the interpreter at that Trump-Putin meeting to be subpoenaed. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta reacting with nil. Take a listen.
So please don't say that somehow this is the usual behavior for presidents meeting at summits.
Leon, with all great respect, Leon, with all great respect, think about what you're saying here. You are saying then there is a move. We want to talk to the interpreter in that room, and we want to question what was said.
I'm not saying that.
I know you're
not. I'm not saying that.
So you are against some of these leading Democrats who are pushing it. You think that would be a mistake, right?
I'm not. I don't think we ought to talk to the interpreter. I think we ought to talk to the president and to the Secretary of State about what was discussed in that meeting. That's what I'm saying.
So, Morgan, what were intelligent folks at the National Security Forum saying about this meeting?
Sorry, did you say, Charles, what were people saying about
the Trump-Putin meeting? I mean, to me, it's two different things. You had the press conference, and then you had the 2.5-hour meeting.
That's true.
We don't really know what happened there. But I think some are using or trying to leverage the performance at the press conference as a way or an excuse to actually learn more and even go as far as subpoenaing, giving a subpoena to the interpreter.
Right. So the subpoenaing the interpreter, Charles, that's just political theater. I mean, that's not going to happen in these committees. Every committee has their own rules. The Democrats do not control any of these committees. Some committees you need both the ranking and the minority leader minority chairman to agree to that. But getting all the parliamentary stuff aside, what will happen if there were to be a subpoena to the interpreter, which is incredibly, highly unlikely? The White House would then, the White House legal advisor would just exert executive privilege. And executive privilege, according to the law of the land, trumps everything. It trumps FOIA, it trumps subpoena. We've seen many administrations use that before. So I doubt very seriously that this interpreter will be subpoenaed. If they were, clearly the administration would exert executive privilege. And the reason that they would do so is because, you know, every White House needs to have their own messaging, their own negotiations behind the scenes, and that has to be protected. And every White House at some point in time uses executive privilege.
So then let me then let's take this way. So how much of that meeting should the American public, do we have a right to know? And how much do you think the White House should share with the American public?
I think it's important for the White House to have a comprehensive strategy, a communication strategy to the American people on what their policy is with Iran. To me, that's far more important than the specifics of what happened in a meeting. The President of the United States, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whoever it is, that individual is always going to have meetings with their foreign counterparts. There's typically a very vague readout from the White House, no matter what administration it is. We never get the intimate details between two world leaders, between our president, no matter who it is. This isn't a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. What's really important, which was important for me, what I watched very closely, Charles, was whether the sanctions were lifted or whether Russia got anything out of that meeting. I think Russia thinks they got a PR victory out of that meeting, but for the things that matter to me as someone who worked on sanctions for a long time, sanctions were not lifted, and Putin didn't get any of the economic things that he wanted to get out of that meeting.